Hello everyone, this is Alice at Welldoing. I'm here with Julia Bueno, who is an integrative psychotherapist. She is the author of The Brink of Being and also of the new book, Everyone's a Critic. Thanks for speaking with us, Julia.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Alice. Good to see you.
You too. You open the book by being quite transparent about some of your own self-critical thoughts, and I wondered how it felt sharing that with the world as a therapist.
Yeah, I mean, I did think twice about it. I shared probably the most extreme version of self-criticism that I experienced. I suppose because I wanted to just convey the extremity of self-criticism in a human being, that includes myself. But it was also, I hope I do kind of reveal later on in the introduction, a sort of story of hope, because I end on the note that I've moved on a lot. I mean, that was many years back, and through my own therapy and my own work, I don't experience that anymore. So there was a sort of a happy ending, if you like, to that rather raw beginning. But I also think it's important for people to realize that therapists are humans. You know, we are, as a card-carrying member of the human race, I have flaws and vulnerabilities too.
Absolutely. I mean, such an important subject. I mean, I personally am very drawn to it. I remember a friend of mine, quite early in our friendship, turned to me once and asked me the most important question ever, which was, why do you hate yourself so much? And I hadn't even realized how I was talking to myself, basically. And you talk a lot in the book about it being a habit. And I just wanted, I wanted to ask whether you could explain, how can that happen? How can it come to be that it's a habit that we don't even notice?
Well, that's a really interesting anecdote, because that's a frequent experience in my consulting room. Actually, quite a lot of the work I do is like your friend did, just pointing out to somebody. It hadn't come to therapy about self-criticism, it'd come about something else, but it sort of quickly revealed to me how they are treating themselves. But I think, I don't know whether this metaphor works, but during the winter lockdown, do you remember that sort of really grim, God, what kept me very sane and relatively happy was every Sunday I'd go for a walk with a very good friend of mine who's an architectural historian, and we'd meet in various bits of London in the freezing cold and go on these long walks where he'd point out and teach me about the architecture of London. Now, I was born on Hyde Park Corner. I've lived in London for 50 years and have scurried around just not being aware of these amazing buildings. And I sort of learnt to look and to see London in different light. So I guess this is where I wonder whether the metaphor works, but you know, equally in our internal world, if we've lived for many, many years with an internal world just as it is, you know, there's that building there that's being nasty to me. We don't necessarily kind of notice it. We take it for granted. So having my architect friend point out, look at this building this new way, is sort of similarly, I think it's very easy to just accept it as the norm, like you did. It sounds like, Alice, it just was second nature to you.
And you make a distinction between self-critic and inner critic. And I was wondering if you could tell us.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably unnecessarily technical. I mean, I brought it in because a lot of my thinking and practice and reading has been influenced by Professor Paul Gilbert, who is sort of pioneered compassion-focused therapy in the world, really. And I did some early training with him, and he writes a lot about self-criticism. But so it's a distinction he makes. And so technically an inner critic is one who isn't necessarily yourself. So, I mean, I put this in the book. A very clear example for me is I had a really nasty my first job as a trainee solicitor many years ago was, you know, I was plonked as an apprentice with a senior solicitor who was really nasty. It just was. I mean, it wasn't me, he's objectively was so, and said particularly cruel things to me. And I can still sort of, sometimes his voice will rear up in my head. Now that's an inner critic. I know it's not me, I know it's him. But of course, the line can get very blurred because we internalize inner critics, we internalize external, we can internalize other people's voices that become ours. But that's technically the distinction. But the people use the two interchangeably, and I think, you know, that's okay too.
Makes sense. And you mentioned pointing out to your clients self-criticism, even if it's not what they've come for. And are there any particular mental health challenges where self-criticism thrives more obviously? Have you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, one obvious example is in depression, that it's absolutely integral part, it's sort of symptomatic of depression, that our self-worth plummets and we feel very badly about ourselves. But equally, you know, there's a question about extreme self-criticism can sort of precipitate a depression. So it's definitely inextricably bound up with that. It's also, as I write about it, with anxiety. And my, you know, that example of me at the beginning was my self-criticism very much played out in a social anxiety that's really common. But as I said, it sort of runs like a golden thread through so many presenting issues. If you work with labels, not all therapists do, but, you know, in eating disorders and sort of, I don't know, imposter syndrome and all these other words, you know, absolutely. But I suppose going back to that point about people not really noticing it, they might come with X, but they don't notice their self-criticism. Quite often I find that it sort of sits on top of whatever the presenting issue is. It's because a lot of people feel judgy of themselves for being in a therapy room in the first place, such as my experience. You know, they're pissed off with themselves for sabotaging their lives. Of course, we're not consciously sabotaging our lives if we're anxious or depressed or jealous or whatever these things. But so yeah, I find myself sort of dealing with that bit first and pointing it out.
And do you think people are more self-critical now than older generations or earlier generations?
Of course, you know, we don't have the data on that. I don't know. And
do you think there are things that could have made things?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely in my lifetime I can come back to that. But just as you were saying that, you know, I was thinking in my first book, The Brink of Being, I did a bit of sort of research into early modern history, and of course that was a time when we, in England alone, we all lived sort of in God's grace and sort of terrified of God's wrath. And I suppose we might have felt very self-critical then from different sources. But anyway, that's conjecture. But what I do think I know from my adult life is, I think when I compare back to my childhood and adolescence, things have changed so much. And I think we have become increasingly competitive and individualistic and capitalistic, and all of this is very fertile breeding ground for setting us all up to fail. There is so much pressure to succeed, achieve, be good, look good, and you know, for what might be sort of obvious to you reasons now, but you know, it's social media. I mean, it's my education and was so different from the kids now, and I grew up, thank God, without social media. So yeah, as I say, I think there is a lot that I have witnessed in my adulthood, and I certainly have noticed, I suppose, more in the past 5-10 years, that all playing out.
Under pressure to be happy and positive
and eco-friendly, and you know, I write and have spoken quite a bit about pregnancy and motherhood, because that was very much the subject of my first book. But I think, you know, I think most of us will be in agreement here that women have a sort of rum lot in the world, and things we're at kind of base camp of a massive mountain in terms of things improving, but I very much look through the lens of the pressures on women to conceive and to gestate and to give birth and to mother, with various sort of value judgments to do it, to succeed in that, and to do well. And that, you know, that certainly has a significant bearing on those experiences. And I talk about those a lot in my consulting room, although I don't explore that in the book. It's one area I don't dig into, but yes, the list is long.
And how might a harsh self-critic show up in kind of day-to-day behavior, things like people pleasing, and what are the most common ways?
Yeah, people holding oneself back by sort of relegating your own self for, as you say, we can bend ourselves out of shape in order to kind of keep keep the other person, keep you in the other person's mind as sort of okay. That can be very hard work. And just, I suppose, also shortchanging yourself, saying no to things that you might otherwise want to be doing, but you just don't think you're good enough, or just exhausting yourself through kind of pushing yourself through perfectionism is another way it kind of plays out. So it can be pretty pervasive.
It's really interesting. It's really interesting. And it kind of relates to my next question, because it's self-critic is obviously very much about yourself, as the name suggests. But it seems to show up most detrimentally in these very social situations. So you might kind of anticipate feeling guilty about something, or you, if you feel that someone was angry at you, you might berate yourself for a very long time afterwards, or you might avoid social situations. And so it's like, if it's there to keep us socially, is it there to keep us socially safe? And why is that so potent for us?
Well, we are social creatures, you know, we are fundamentally wired to be in relationship with other people. And we know this more and more, you know, especially in recent years, the sort of neuroscience has really caught up to understand that, you know, fresh from birth, we come out of the womb with our little neurons sort of searching for another, you know, a caregiver and a mum to wire towards. You know, that's how we thrive and survive, is in relationship with other people. We all regulate each other. So it's really, really threatening to be ousted from the group, or to be kind of othered in some way.
Is that why childhood bullying has such an impact into adulthood?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yes, it's when we leave the family home to go to school, that's without the the family backup, that's a very kind of exposing time, isn't it? And we're learning so much through childhood. You know, our brains are so busy and our bodies are so busy wiring and growing and learning how to relate to peers. And I mean, especially this plays out in adolescence, it's sort of absolutely crucial, isn't it? We turn our back to our family to forge our sense of self with each other. And it's so important to kind of fit in and to feel a part of and to find your tribe. So bullying there can be extremely pernicious and corrosive. And we just, thank goodness, we've been taking this far more seriously in my lifetime. I don't think there's a school that doesn't have an anti-bullying policy now, but certainly in my day that didn't exist. And so because we've understood the lasting impact on bullying on someone. And I write about this. Yeah, I think the thing about bullying for a lot of, I mean, it'd be interesting to see how the cohort coming into adulthood, because until it's been sort of more talked about and accepted as sort of not okay, I think it's been less stigmatized and shame around it. I talked to a lot of adults who have been bullied in childhood who sort of feel the double whammy of the incident itself, but also the shame of being a victim. I think that has arguably loosened up a bit. There's more of a kind of bullies are the baddies and the victims are more empowered, but for a long time that didn't exist. So there was this sort of tremendous shame that people would be, I mean, I've certainly talked to a lot of people in adulthood who wouldn't admit to being bullied for a very long time, because they sort of somehow they criticize themselves for being victim in the first place.
Yeah. And
I should also say that I didn't write about this because obviously I couldn't write about everything, but bullying goes on in adulthood, and one way of looking at sort of abusive relationships or indeed in the workplace is through a kind of bullying lens, and those are pretty pernicious experiences as well.
Of course. And then obviously that's an individual kind of experience, and there's the wider systemic issues you talk about importantly, like issues around gender and race and sexuality, and how that might play into self-criticism as well. I was wondering what you've learned from your clients over the years in that area, those areas.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you come into the world or live in the world 24/7, where you are othered in whatever way, you're receiving messages that you're not only just sort of different. I mean, being different, the idea is to kind of tolerate difference well, but if you're not only just being different, but being judged for being different. So not as good as, lesser than, whether that's through your color of your skin or your sexuality or a gender identity, or then yeah, there's some of those sort of war of attrition, really. Some of many parts can weigh you down, and on some level you like, going back to the beginning about just taking things for granted as sort of not normal. I spoke to so many women in the wake of the kind of Me Too explosion, and I suppose I'm not going to sort of single out a particular age group, but I'm 50 now, but so many of my kind of friends around my age, we realized just how much we screened out of the misogyny that we'd experienced, and the kind of inappropriate sort of sexual experiences we had, because we just sort of accepted it as normal. So yeah, I mean, culture is really powerful, and what's sort of so important, and what I think my book's about is just bringing it into your consciousness and realizing that our affected self-worth is worth, very beginning, the very start of it is just noticing it, realizing it, not just sort of accepting it as is, or as sort of inevitability.
So there's some people might have an idea that being critical of themselves is a way of improving. So I was wondering what you might say to people who would make that point, that how would they ever get better or reach their goals if they weren't critical of themselves?
I think that, that's a really good point. It's really common. I think that's a really common response to somebody's relationship with their self-critic. They sort of they've come to believe that it is their greatest motivating factor, and that they wouldn't achieve great heights without it, because the alternative would be sort of too slippery, and it might make them sort of soften up too much. And I suppose what I would say to that is that it's a load of bollocks, to use technical phrase. There's lots of data out there, more and more coming out, especially from the States, around Kristin Neff, who's the leading researcher and pioneer in this topic, that shows that more self-compassionate ways and means of motivating yourself, we do better, we achieve better, and the results are longer lasting. And so, data aside, I think most people I talk to intuitively understand that they would want to motivate their loved ones or their children, or if they're teachers. I do work with a lot of teachers. If you ask them the question, how do you motivate your kids, it's not walking around the class with a whip saying, if you don't get 10 out of 10, you're rubbish. People intuitively understand that they want to motivate others with much more of a kind of positive praise and kind of compassion, and making mistakes is all part and parcel of learning. I mean, I've never seen a child kind of pick up a pen and write calligraphy. It's a sort of spider on a piece of paper for years. So, but somehow our kind of mind scrambles when we think about turning that back on ourselves. We just sort of switch paradigms, and we're supposed to kind of respond differently. So, it's just learning to accept that we are like you and you and you, and we can achieve great things. Being kinder to yourself, and more self-compassionate stance, does not mean we don't do well. It's not what's the word, antidotal to achieving great heights. So yeah, that's some of what I might say to somebody.
It's obviously hard to get there yourself. So, I mean, how does therapy help with this particular area?
Yeah, I mean, in probably a few ways. And, I write in the book about some of the sources of self-criticism, some of which might need a bit of processing in therapy, especially if there's some real trauma or hurt or kind of wounding there. My first chapter, I talk about early imprints, so the effect of our caregivers can have on us and can spark the kind of genesis of self-criticism. We might have a very explicitly critical parent who, says and behaves in pretty powerful ways that means that we come to believe that we are, we're not good, we're not good enough, we're not worthy, we might, and that might be in comparison to a sibling or otherwise, or it might be in more kind of subtle ways. Sometimes it might be that a parent isn't necessarily sort of explicitly critical, but might be, for example, psychologically or otherwise absent. You know, they might be struggling with their own mental health, and they might sort of literally remove themselves from the house, or psychologically remove themselves to go to bed for hours on end. And when we're little, you know, we don't have the wherewithal, the understanding to think, oh, you know, poor mum had a really tough time and she's struggling with her mental health, and that must be why, and you know, I'm okay. The way with it, it's really, really usual for us when we're little to make sense of things like that, to think, oh God, it must be my fault, you know, I'm not being good enough. That's just a sort of self-blame is often a way to fill the gaps. We do it in adulthood as well when we don't understand things, and there's a gap in understanding. We think, well, it must be me. So, you know, that could be another kind of route. And with stories like that, that might need a bit of unpacking in therapy, and if a therapist can help you do that, and indeed another kind of associated with that. I mean, some therapists talk about, they use the phrasing of kind of reparenting, but helping our clients to get in contact with or galvanize their compassionate self, which is there anyway, because every client I speak to does have compassion. It pours out in all sorts of directions away from them, but helping them to turn the tap back on themselves. And you know, that can take a while, but I suppose the other thing therapy can do apart from that sort of processing work is to mirror it yourself, you know, as a therapist, to model self-compassion. You can do that too. Can be another important role.
And what if therapy kind of triggers a self-critic? Because therapy isn't easy necessarily. You might think you're crap at therapy, that you don't know how to engage, or you don't do it properly, or what advice would you give people?
Well, I mean, that's sort of grist the mill for a lot of therapists. Oh, great, it's in the room.
Okay.
So, you know, if that's coming up, and I would encourage any client, if they're feeling that, to speak of it, because that's the self-critic in the room. And that's, you know, as I say, one of us therapists love to work, I can't speak for every therapist, but having a problem live in the room, you know, that's when we can really, it's in the relationship between the two of us. Some great work can be done, rather than I'm not saying you can't do great work, but when it's sort of abstract and we're talking about something that might have happened or is familiar and it's not in the room, it's not the same, it's not live. So, and yeah, that is very usual for a self-critic to share with me they think they're doing it wrong. I also think that some of that's to do with the fact that therapy is this sort of strange, misunderstood process, and you know that a lot of people who know nothing about it might well sort of, if you're a therapist like myself who doesn't work in a kind of modular way and doesn't have a sort of program or homework and pen and paper, we're not kind of working through stages, it can feel a bit sort of discombobulating to be just talking about things, and you might think, so, you know, am I doing it right or wrong? So I'll give them a bit of slack for that as well.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's such a pleasure to talk to you. I have a copy of the book here. Here it is. Everyone's critic.
Thank you very much, Alice.
I highly recommend it. It's super interesting. So thank you very much, Julia.
Not at all. Lovely to see you, and goodbye.
See you soon.